Is it on? Good morning and welcome to the Adult Faith Formation at Montview Presbyterian Church here in Park Hill. I like to say Park Hill because that's where we are. As you know, my name is Malcolm, and my sister reminded me that Black History is not a month. She said it's a lifetime. And today is February the 1st, which is the first day of Black History. I have the honor and privilege this morning to introduce the manager and researcher of the Colorado Black Equity Project. I call it project, you guys call it study. Let me introduce you to Chloe Duplessis. Am I right? Yes. Okay. Is legally blind artist, historian, speaker, whose work explores the contours of memory, access, and material culture, working across visual art, archival research, historical interpretation. Chloe centers on non-visual ways of knowing, touch, sound, narratives, and embodied experience as both method and subject. She earned her degree in cultural studies from the University of New Orleans and has traveled to 9 countries and 24 states in support of her work. In 2024, Chloe was selected to Colorado Black Equity Study, a 2-year historical research program that will document practices and policies that has caused harm to Black Coloradans, preventing access to health, wealth, education, and justice. Personally, I have been watching the Colorado Black Equity Study and Chloe's work over this past year of 2025, and I want to call her the Toni Morrison of Colorado. Just watching her work and how she handles herself and how she manages the team, and I want to call her at this time if she would come and introduce her team to us. Chloe Duplessis.
No pressure, right? And I'll stand. We'll see how it goes. As you can see, I'm very, very tall. So usually mics are, is that good? Can you hear me? Yes. I also have 2 brothers, so I grew up projecting, so I can do it with her. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to share just a little bit of your energy and your capacity with us this morning, and thank you for this kind invitation and all the ways that you have intentionally shown up as a congregation and as a beautiful space of worship for this meaningful work. It really, really encourages us to know that there are people of all experiences and all journeys supporting actively what we like to call as a team, daily repair of harm. Daily repair of harm. So today, for a little bit, we'll talk about all the ways that this beautiful historical research study is doing just that. I know we're all navigating a season right now, collectively. That means many things to many people. Some of the situations that we are actively embracing every single day are sparking and promoting fear and anxiety and angst. For many people of color or persons who work in communities of color or who had really challenging upbringings, it is something that is unfortunately familiar to us. And for many people who have not known fear in these specific ways that we're all witnessing, it is no less hurtful, harmful, and anxiety-inducing. But I have found, as someone who is a granddaughter of a pastor and civil rights leader, that I was born into this work, and my biggest contribution is to be mindful of all the ways in which every single day we have beautiful opportunities to do what we can in our own way. Much like the legacy that many of our families implemented and sowed into our communities and the states that we grew up in, when we come into this world, we settle into this awareness that we can take no credit for what they did. We can only seek to extend that meaningful work in our own ways. And as someone who has made a career out of honestly collecting, presenting, and preserving the stories of persons long gone, it feels appropriate this morning to talk about how we are centering these beautiful stories, promoting the reality of shared history and the blessing of such, and leveraging that hopefully in this time, in this season, to meet the moment. I meet a lot of people out and about speaking on the study, and they often ask me or tell me, that's really cool, or that's really interesting, or And then they ask me why that work is relevant, why Colorado, and why now. That work is relevant because we have long in this country created this energy around Black history that allows for what I call safe distance, right? And so when something is distant, it means on some level you acknowledge it, either because you love it and celebrate it and share it with your children and family, or because you operate in a fear-based model and mode and you seek to suppress it, minimize it, or erase it. Either way, you acknowledge it is relevant and important. And in our country, it is foundational. The contributions of Black Americans is foundational. So then I answer the second question. When people say, why Colorado? Well, then I say, look, as someone who's originally from Louisiana, who's been living here for almost a decade, I will tell you, Colorado is many things. It's gorgeous, there's access to nature, there are really kind, loving people, there's lots of opportunity, I get it. There's a reason me and my family are here. But then I say, why not Colorado? Because Colorado is not an island. And is it so far-fetched to believe that Colorado, while it was not a slave-holding state, could potentially have some of the energy and some of the ideology that other slave-holding states had if, in fact, the people who founded our fair state came from slave-holding families or even owned enslaved people themselves. I don't think it's too far-fetched, and our research has demonstrated that it's not. 1 month into the study last year, our research team made a remarkable discovery and officially confirmed that enslavement did exist in Colorado. Now, this was major because for many, many years, both people who were for and against this movement to honor Black history and shared history were very unclear about that. Very unclear. Now, granted, I often say the slavery in Colorado did not look like a scene from Gone with the Wind, with porches and people laying on a veranda. But however, it was here. And one of our persons that we hold in high esteem, Mr. Estes, even brought from his native state of Georgia with him 5 enslaved people when he came to Colorado. And when he left years later, he took his supplies, his materials, and he also took 5 enslaved people. It is important to recognize that people coming here looking for opportunity in the beautiful state of Colorado also brought property. And in that season, Black people were viewed as property. Now, all the Black people that came into Colorado did not come through that channel, but it's important to acknowledge that. Because when you acknowledge something, you create a sense of space. And that space allows you to have meaningful conversation, meaningful exchanges, and dare I say it, you may, on some level, begin to believe that the person who sits across from you, who may have had a very different life story, and a very different experience, and a very different journey, may actually have just as much in common with you. Maybe even more than you even held room for. Ideally, we all want the same things: quality of life, a safe place to live. We want for our families to flourish. We want to be able to take a vacation every now and then. I'm just saying, you know, we want to be able to enjoy a cup of coffee, read the paper, and to have a peaceful, contributive existence. That energy, that desire, is not something that is confined to one ethnic group or one experience. I am often very, very tough on my country. I gave a talk last month, and I actually entitled the talk, "When was the last time you were proud of America?" And I did so because, as someone who can trace their family to America going back 4 generations. but who does not know the names of family members beyond two because of slavery, and someone who was born into the Deep South, who has traveled extensively, who now lives in Colorado, one thing is consistent. Wherever people of color exist, there exists this underlying notion that either will honor their greatness and their capacity to endure all the things in spite of, and create some of the things we love the most, cuisine and music and the arts and the framework and the physical buildings, the pillars, the boards. And oftentimes that energy, for whatever reason, is accompanied by a really deeply rooted sense of hatred. Oftentimes, this hatred is so cleverly masked that it manifests as privilege. And privilege is very dangerous because there are a number of people in this season who feel as though it's not a thing, to which I suggest someone is really doing a good job. It's more powerful than we ever knew. So when people ask me those three questions, why is this relevant? Why Colorado? And why now? I submit it's important because Black history is not distant. It's not something that happened in the 50s, 40s, and before. There is discrimination, there exists privilege, and all of these systemic challenges that are currently here, preventing families from obtaining mortgages, supporting their businesses, feeling safe at home, all of the things oftentimes people take for granted. It's important to do this work because in doing this work, when the study is turned over in March of 2027 to the commission, we have some beautiful commissioners here. If you'll just raise your hands to support. We have wonderful commissioners. When it's turned over to the commission and to the new governor in March of 2027, they will then engage a third-party organization to do a complete analysis of the report that our research team turns over. That will hopefully inform policies, practices, and active means of repair. And that means many different things to different people. That is beyond our scope of work as research historians. But we are really, really encouraged and deeply blessed to know that by honoring 165 years of research over the next year and presenting a work that we will be deeply proud of, approximately 250 pages, 7 sections, that will be available for the public to review, absorb, experience, and relish, that we are doing our part. So I wanted to share a little bit of history about the study, talk about why we're doing it. I take no credit for getting us to this point. Our commissioners and a lot of people in grassroots community here throughout the state of all experiences worked for years to raise the funds, to push the bill that became the law, to create the positions we now occupy proudly, respectfully. But I will say that we have a measure of encouragement every day we walk into History Colorado, that in a season where many people feel they have to do things, we get to do this. And even though our roles are very clearly defined with this study, you in your own way, in your own life, in your own journey, every day you arise with the gift of air in your lungs from God. You have the opportunity to do the same by sharing your story. If you've worked in a community of color, we have an active oral history initiative that runs throughout the year for Black Coloradans and persons who worked in Black community. We'd love to hear from you what you've experienced. If you are a Black Coloradan, we definitely want to hear from you and add your story to this beautiful roll of narratives and shared histories. Additionally, you can sow into the study by donating. You all made tremendous contribution to the work thus far, and we're deeply grateful. Or you can simply share. You can post, you can share, you can read. You can tell friends in other states. Now, if they're jealous, that's their own thing. Don't take ownership of that. We're kind of innovative here, you know. but you can share. Never underestimate the role that you can play in your own way. So with that said, I wanted to bring you full circle, talk about what we're doing. Also share that we are only $570K from officially reaching the $1.3 million goal. This study is funded by people. No federal dollars, no state dollars. So please give yourselves a hand for that. Thank you so much. So let's dive into the part that I'm sure you're all waiting for. Let's talk to the research team. So Dr. Scott Spillman, to my immediate left, is our senior researcher. Scott is one of the nation's foremost authorities on early American history, culture, and is a published author whose book dives into how slavery is studied and elevated and centered and researched. And John Valdez is an economist. He's a research historian. He's originally from Durango, Colorado, yay, and brings a beautiful history to this work as someone who can trace his family roots back many, many generations. So we'll let these gentlemen speak a little bit about their focus of study, and then we'll open briefly for Q&A. Thank you again for your attention.
Thanks, Chloe, for that introduction and sort of overview of what we're up to. Does this work? Can you all hear me? Oh, wait. Thank you, Malcolm. So I'm going to get a little more into the concrete nuts and bolts of what we're up to in the Colorado Black Equity Study to give you all an idea of the kind of work that we're doing and the kinds of things that we're finding in our research. As Chloe mentioned, our report is due to the Legislative Commission that governs us in March of 2027. And we started our work in December of 2024, so we're almost exactly at the halfway point right now. And so we've accomplished a lot, but we still have a lot to do in the next 13 and a half months or so. Our study's scope, our charge, is to trace the history of discrimination and other state-based practices that have caused harm to Black Coloradans over the full scope of Colorado history. And so that means that we're covering everything from Colorado territory in the 1860s all the way up until today, and we're covering the whole state, not just Denver or the Front Range, but all the way out to Durango, where John's from, and up to Fort Morgan and down to La Junta. That is a huge amount of both time and space to try to cover for this work. And so we've tried to organize it by breaking it down into 4 main buckets or themes that we're studying. And those buckets are wealth, health, education, and justice. And I'll say a little bit about what we're looking at within each of those themes and then go a little bit more deeply into kind of how we're trying to accomplish this work. And so for wealth, which is largely the work of my friend John here, who is a historian and economist, which is important, he's looking at stuff like employment discrimination, housing, which is often a person in America's main asset that they're acquiring and passing down, business formation, and access to things like banking and credit and financing. Under health, we're looking at things like access to medical training and care. Some of you might be familiar with the story of Justina Ford, who of course was denied access to hospitals in the early 20th century and delivered some incredible number of thousands of babies, 9,000 babies, Chloe reminds me, at our house in 5 Points. And we've seen similar stories of other doctors who had trouble getting admitting privileges at hospitals, who weren't able to train at nursing schools, and so on. So we're looking at that kind of thing, but we're also looking at access to healthy food, good nutrition, access to open space, parks, a clean environment, which we all appreciate and enjoy about living here in Colorado. To what extent has that been available to Black Coloradans? All that's under the health bucket. Then under the education bucket, we're looking primarily at pre-K through 12 education. What have the access and opportunities for Black Coloradans been there? You all may be familiar with, the story of Denver Public Schools, the segregation that existed before the Keys v. School District Number 1 case from 1973, and then the busing that was in place for about 2 decades after that. And so we're interested in, examining what how those different changes in policy for education have affected Black Coloradans, and then within schools, whether Black students have been steered to particular courses or tracks, whether they had access to the same curriculum, what the disciplinary consequences for them within particular schools were, and then also, of course, higher education. What has Black access to higher education been like over the course of Colorado history? To what extent have Black students been welcome on Colorado higher education campuses and in faculties and administrations? And then finally, our fourth bucket, which is a pretty big one, an important one for us, is justice, where one of our researchers, Melissa Jones, who recently received her PhD from Southern Miss studying racial violence and Reconstruction, she's looking at things like policing, sentencing, incarceration, and community safety. She's been doing some incredible work looking at in the state archives and History Colorado at ledgers of different arrests over the years to try to trace for people going to the Colorado State Penitentiary from what counties were Black Coloradans at the state penitentiary coming, what were they charged with, what were their sentences, and how does that compare to white Coloradans, other Coloradans, were there disparities there? And so those are some of the things that we're looking at in our different buckets. Because this is a large study, we do have a decent team to try to tackle all of this. We're based at History Colorado, as Chloe and Malcolm mentioned, and we have 4 full-time researchers, including myself and John, who are working on it. Our other 2 are Missy, whom I mentioned, and then Shatoya Walker, who's heading up our oral history initiative. And then we also have a number of contractors and fellows who are doing some sort of part-time work or specialized research projects for us. And we're doing this research using a variety of different types of sources. We're using archival records from places like the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, and the state archives. We're using newspapers, many of which have been digitized through the Colorado Historic Newspapers collection going all the way back to the 1860s. We're using doctoral and master's dissertations, some existing studies, looking through manuscript census records, and then going through both existing oral histories and trying to collect as many new oral histories as we can to then store at History Colorado in perpetuity to document the experiences of Black Coloradans. And so our report, what we're trying to produce by next March, is going to use all that information, all those different themes, all those different sources, to try to tell the story of Black Colorado history from the territorial period to today, to show what constraints Black Coloradans have faced, but also the resilience that they've shown in trying to overcome some of those constraints. We're going to put that online, and we're going to deliver it to the Legislative Commission. It'll be available for free, our final report. We're trying to supplement it online as well with a variety of different types of resources for both the general public and researchers to be able to use. And so John has been really instrumental in helping me out in thinking about, what can we actually do in that space? So we're going to try to put up data tables that we generate in the course of our research, interactive maps where people can look at things like, for housing, different restrictive covenants, and different policies to keep the Black population, particularly in Denver, sort of in particular neighborhoods. We're going to put primary sources so that people can look at the kind of information that we're looking at. And then we're also going to put those oral histories so that people can listen to and read the stories of Black Coloradans told by the people who lived it. And we're going to try to develop a variety of lesson plans and other teacher resources, because we do believe and think that our work can be really influential and instrumental in shaping education in Colorado, trying to open up new ways of thinking about and talking about and learning about Colorado history, as well as new ways of thinking about Black history. It's not something that just happens in the South or in northern cities, but that also happens in the Mountain West. And so, as I said, we're going to try to answer that legislative charge to show what the discrimination that Black Coloradans have faced is. We're going to try to make this useful in terms of education in the state, in middle schools, high schools, colleges. We're also going to try to make that report and everything that we do accessible. This is not going to be a jargon-filled report. That's not the way that I think that history should be done. I want it to be accessible and readable for the average Coloradan so that we can all learn as a part of this process. And finally, but we do want it to have scholarly merit, and we want our work to be laying a foundation then for all future work that's done about Black history in Colorado. Sort of a one-stop shop. If you're looking for information, you can go to our website in the future, when we have one, and find, what is known about Black Colorado, and then how can I, as a future researcher, build on that to create new knowledge. And so, as I said, a lot of our research is still in progress, but we have drafted about maybe 40 to 50% of the report, covering from the gold rush in the late 1850s all the way up until the Great Depression and New Deal in the 1930s. One constant that we have found throughout that period is that Black Coloradans have faced employment discrimination, and that employment discrimination determined a lot of the rest of their experience. All the way up until World War II, Black men were primarily constrained to kind of low-wage jobs like porter, janitor, servant, cook, things like that. Occasionally things that allowed them to build wealth and to actually own their own business. So being a cook could lead to becoming a restaurateur. Being a barber could lead to owning your own barber shop. Many of the early civil rights activists in Denver in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s were actually barbers because that was the path to the middle class and to sort of a leadership position in the Black community. And then Black women, something like 90% of Black women worked as domestic servants up until the 1930s. And so that determined a lot about their position in society. They weren't able to earn much money, and so they were then not able to afford high-quality housing, typically lived near railroad tracks, near rivers that were prone to flooding, in the older and less well-kept parts of town, both in Denver, but then you also see that in places like Pueblo, where a lot of Black Coloradans lived along the river, in different mountain towns, and so on. We've also found that the state often has actually pretty good laws when it comes to civil rights and equality. The state has a provision a clause in the state constitution calling for non-discrimination in education. And that has been there since 1876, and that is a great thing to have. The state also in the 1880s and 1890s passed civil rights laws calling for non-discrimination in public accommodations. But what we have found is that the state, particularly before the 1950s, often fell short in the enforcement of those laws. There was the provision, the clause for non-discrimination in education, but Denver schools from, say, the 19-teens or 1920s, certainly through then the 1960s, were pretty heavily segregated, with Black students attending a handful of elementary schools and then primarily Manual High School here. Similarly, with the civil rights laws, they called for non-discrimination in things like restaurant accommodations, hotels, theaters, and so on. But we have many articles and testimonies from Black Coloradans saying, that they called around to different hotels. They were turned down when they went in person, that they tried to go to the theater and they were seated in the balcony. You know, all of these sort of markers of segregation and discrimination that existed and that they had no recourse to through the police or any kind of law. There are suits that happened, but they were both expensive and, you know, occasionally you could get some sort of small settlement in them, but they didn't end up changing practice on a large scale. They were kind of one-off suits that people were occasionally able to pursue. And so those are two of the constants we've seen throughout that period. But then there are also sort of particular fights and battles that happen at different periods. And so in the very early part of Colorado, in the territorial period, those two big battles were for voting rights and for equal education, to establish those as Colorado Territory was becoming a state. And so Black Coloradans were really instrumental in fighting for the right to get the vote, both here and in territories across the country. So they were instrumental in the federal government passing a law in 1867 calling for there to be equal right to vote in all federal territories, which Colorado was at that time. Black Coloradans also pushed primarily in Central City and Denver for the right to an equal education, which they were able to secure in the early 1870s and then get written into that state constitution in 1876. Then after Colorado became a state in the late 19th century, the fights then shifted to primarily one of public accommodations, and that's when those two civil rights laws I mentioned in the 1880s and 90s were passed, but also criminal justice, because if you know some about the history of criminal justice in the United States, you might know that the late 19th century is when we see the rise of lynching, primarily in the South, but you also see lynching in Colorado. Something like 7 to 10 Black Coloradans were lynched in the period from the 1860s to the early 1900s. And so there was a constant battle with police and with sort of broader society to try to get there to be greater care and concern for Black men. They were all Black men who were lynched, to be taken better care of and protected when they were arrested for crimes, and when there was sort of suspicion that there could be a lynching in the offing. And so those were two major fights in that early statehood period. And then most recently, I've been writing about the period from the 19-teens to the 1930s, when after the Black population was fairly well established here, there was a strong Black community in Denver, in Pueblo, in some other cities. And this is at the time of the Great Migration, when a large number of Black Southerners are starting to move to northern cities, but also out here to Denver, and you see a rise in the Black population. In response to that, what we see here is a major racial retrenchment, is the only way that I know how to put it. You all might know that the Ku Klux Klan became quite strong here in Colorado for a few years in the 1920s. And so the Klan had this meteoric rise in the 20s. I've recently wrote an article about something I found where there were a handful of bombings over in my neighborhood in City Park West of different Black families as they were trying to move out of that 5 Points area closer to City Park. There were a handful of bombings and mobs of 200, 250 people who would go to these houses recently bought by Black families to try to intimidate them and move them out. They were largely successful in that, in keeping the Black community in Denver, then in 5 Points and Whittier in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And so you see that push for greater residential segregation in that period. We also see a push for greater school segregation in that period. One thing that the school segregators hoped was that if they could segregate the schools in Colorado, then that would sort of enact a de facto residential segregation because families would not be likely to move very far from where their kids were able to go to school. And so there was actually, in the city of Denver, a policy from the early 20s until 1927 that school social functions would be segregated. Until finally the state Supreme Court, using that clause in the Colorado State Constitution that I mentioned about non-discrimination in education, overturned that policy. And so that's one example of why it's good, even if laws and constitutional clauses sometimes aren't enforced, to have them on paper, to have them as a backstop that you can sometimes be able to get people to use. And so the next up, we're going to be looking at the mid-century period, moving into World War II and then the post-war period. World War II completely transformed Colorado, as you all might know. And so it brought a huge number of new people in and generated a lot of dynamic change, resulting ultimately in a huge number of civil rights bills in the 1950s. And so we're going to be talking about those. And then, of course, because I'm here in Park Hill, I want to note that this neighborhood is going to play a starring role in the post-war portion of our story. You all could probably teach me some about that, the way that some churches like Montview here worked with neighbors to form the Park Hill Action Committee and really work to manage and make sure that integration happened in a peaceful way in communities like this one. And then looking ahead, our researchers are now turning to kind of the more recent past. John is looking at banking in the 80s, 90s, and 21st century, at things like how did the Great Recession affect Black access to housing, banking, and credit. We're also looking at policing, the changing sentencing laws, the rise of mass incarceration since the 1980s. And we also have some contractors working for us on looking at Colorado Springs specifically, the Black military and veteran population there, as well as on what I mentioned earlier, the busing and school choice eras. And maybe I'll just end there with what we're kind of looking forward to, because I do want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions in case you all want to talk to us some. Just briefly before I end, I do want to make one more note in terms of how to support us. I mentioned Shatoya Walker as our oral historian. If anyone here had any experience with the civil rights movement, with busing, with integration in Park Hill, with any of these topics, we would be really excited to hear from you. And you can sign up for that online or just talk to one of us. And then I do also want to mention that we have a handful of listening sessions coming up in different communities. We've got a listening session up in Boulder on March 21st, out in Durango on April 11th, and then in Colorado Springs on May 2nd. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Scott. Can you tell that he's been in the work? Deeply proud of our research team. So earlier when we started talking, I talked about a talk I had last month that asked the question, when was the last time you were proud of your country? As someone who knows that they are American, who was born into this country, it is oftentimes very, very interesting to me to note that part of being a part of something, whether it's a group, a team, a collective, often weighs very, very heavily on whether or not the other members of that group, that team, that collective, feel that you belong. So just for a moment, if you will, just breathe very, very deeply and close your eyes in this moment, a moment we're all blessed to share. We're here because of this work, for this specific moment. Breathe very, very deeply and think about that. Think about the power of that. Think about what it means to be American, what it means to be Coloradan, and think about the last time you did not feel that those two were your truth, or that you were out of sync, out of line with the energy that currently permeates all the things. I submit to you in this very moment that based upon your ethnic lineage and heritage right now across our state and our country, there are a number of people who were born in this country who have deep love, just as I do for this country, as we do for this country, who often feel at least one time, once a week or once a day, that they are actively living, working, sowing, existing in a space, in a state, in a country that does not feel that they belong. This is not just about safety and history and repair. This is, at its truest sense, it's about quality of life and the fact that everyone should have access to quality of life. And as believers, it's about belonging. It's about belonging. This work is about belonging. And when you center belonging and you center people, you can literally shift time and space and energy to create room for extraordinary things to happen. So while we reflect today on how we feel about our country, about our state, our connections, our sense of belonging, I submit to you as someone who has been studying all of the trauma and oppression of the last 200 years for almost 20 years, much like my colleagues, that I stand now not with a heavy heart or in a tough space, shrouded by doubt. I believe and hold dear hope that we, through conversation, discussion, and intentional support of beautiful research projects, Dr. Malcolm, can do just that, can repair, can heal, and can activate and center belonging. We have an opportunity to do something that no other generation has done, in a way that no other generation has. And that is both a beautiful responsibility, but a tremendous, tremendous calling. So in this moment, as you open your eyes, we'll shift energy for a brief Q&A. And I would like to encourage you to ask the questions that are on your heart. I would also like to encourage you, if you have any questions or interest around wealth access, to reach out and specifically ask those today, because my colleague, John Valdez, has done amazing work over the past year, and we invited him this morning. Usually it's me or it's Scott. We're tag teaming it. We're a duo. But we wanted to invite John this morning because, ultimately this will be able to shore up some policy that will be very, very nurturing as relates to access of quality of life and wealth. So feel free to ask those questions. Dr. Malcolm, how do you want to do it? Do you want to acknowledge people?
I'm here.
You're here? Okay, all right. The brother to the left. Okay. So we'll get started now.
We only have a
Thank you.
few minutes left, so anybody have any questions? Okay.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to hear all that you guys have shared. I'm curious about, so here we heard some more about Denver and about some other parts of Colorado. I'm wondering if you saw other parts of Colorado that, were you kind of seeing segregation, economic impact because of race in all parts of Colorado, or did it differ?
Yeah, I can maybe speak to that with a little bit of research that I did in some mining towns from the late 19th century, to give you kind of an example. I went through the manuscript census records for San Miguel County, San Juan County, and Ouray County in the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s to see kind of exactly that question, like where were black people in these early mining towns living, what kind of jobs did they have, and so on. And what you see out there, for example, is that there are these giant boarding houses of miners, as you would expect, in these little places like Red Mountain or whatever, like outside of Silverton. And it's just like 100 guys from either, sort of northern states or from like Austria or Italy or somewhere, and there will be like one black cook in that place. And so that's kind of what you see there, is that typically it appears that black men were not really allowed to be miners. And you'll see a few here and there, like in Leadville at its peak, there were a handful of miners, but Leadville had 20, 30,000 people at its peak. And so a handful of black miners is like essentially none. And so black people, even in these mining towns, are primarily in those service positions. And that's one thing that you see, is that that's one reason you don't see as many black Coloradans out in other places, is because they are so heavily restricted to these kind of service positions that exist primarily in larger cities. And so you see them then being concentrated in Denver and some of the larger places on the Front Range, and then even out in outlying places in like the larger mining towns rather than in mining camps, for example. Just because that's what they're allowed to do at that time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Over here we have,
Well, I was
Do you want
to answer a little bit as well to that previous question quickly. As somebody I'm a fourth generation black Coloradan from Ignacio, Colorado, so the reservation down there. There's not a lot of black people there, I think for a reason. We have a huge KKK presence in Bayfield, Colorado. That's basically right next door to Durango. And that's pretty consistent in a lot of different rural areas in Colorado. As somebody from a rural area, it's really difficult to live in those places if you don't have a sense of community and a lot of support from the people, your neighbors around you. So I think that's a big piece of it. Also, to the employment piece, I think a lot of black Coloradans migrated out of some of those areas because they were given positions, titles that were not accurate with what they were actually doing. And so nurses, for example, in a lot of places, they would be given the title of janitor, but they would be nursing and doing high-level healthcare work, and so it's part of the work that I do. So I think we're trying to also illuminate in all these different small areas that these localities had a lot of basically policy prescription power in their specific area. So the state policy didn't always get followed well in these areas because the localities had control over whether or not that was being enforced or not. And so a big piece of the work that we're doing right now is pulling a lot of these policy recommendations from different panels that the Civil Rights Commission did, and the U.S., like the Colorado version of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, kind of like the work that the federal agencies did around going to Grand Junction and some of those areas, and finding that like even the few black people that were there were getting discriminated against pretty heavily economically, but also in healthcare, in justice. And so I think that's been an important piece of it, is learning how different localities are enforcing laws, or whether or not they are enforcing laws.
we have a question.
If I understand correctly, you're just past the midpoint of your project, being compelled to report to the Colorado State Legislature pretty soon. Is that correct?
Yes, we make quarterly reports to our legislative commission, and so we've done 4 so far, I believe, last year. And then it's a little odd because we don't report to them during the legislative session because several of our commissioners are legislators, but we've produced a written report last month for them, and our next in-person one will probably be sometime this summer.
So in that context, and at this point in your research, Can you give us a clue what you're formulating as the actions you're going to want the Colorado legislature to take? And who are your partners to get the legislature to do it?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to clarify the question. Are you asking about next steps, or if we're going to make a request about? I was
No,
unclear.
I'm asking about the recommendations based on your research that you are taking to the legislature. I'm assuming you're formulating some recommendations for action. And if that is so, I'm wondering who your partners are to see that the legislature takes action.
Okay, this is a very beautiful layered question. Okay, thank you. Because that's like 3. We're here for it. Okay, so first thing, we're not making recommendations. We are historians. We're collecting all the information and data. I don't know if you're a basketball fan, but we're lining people up to, yeah, that part. So that is our role. We're very clear on our role. Now, we will have possibly, through some of the pullouts, some gentle suggestions about things that we've seen in the work, and that's a courtesy that we want to offer because we believe so deeply in the work the commissioners are doing, and quite frankly, we'll be living harm, literally, for 2 years. That's a lot, right? That's a lot, especially if you're a person who walks around in brown skin, so it's a lot. And we know that because we're living the work, in totality as a team, there are certain things that we are privy to in this research that the average person would not be. So there will be some areas of opportunity to kind of share things that we have seen, but we're very clear in telling our truth, which is that our job is not to make recommendations. Our job is to deliver a report that is so strong and so intentional and fact-checked that it will literally allow the commission to work with a third-party organization after March of 2027 to do just that over the following year. So that is the role there. Now, I will say we have lots of intentional partners. We have over 100 organizations and individuals that have given thus far to support this study to get us to the point where we're about to actually meet that $1.3 million budget. And they'll be listed in the study under acknowledgments because unless they request not to be, they'll be listed. Additionally, we have a core community partner, Justice for Black Coloradans, is a small nonprofit that is in partnership with Chic, that Sade Cooper, our commissioner, actually leads. Beautiful work being done there. They're important because right now, if you Google Justice for Black Coloradans, they're a fully functioning nonprofit, accepting support and honoring questions led by Yarkenda Payne Diallo, an outstanding woman of courage and capacity, and who is a former educator and has over 20 years of policy work. She is doing 2 things right now in this season with heart and fervor: building and establishing a power base to support Black Coloradans and this study for the next steps. And that looks like people supporting from all layers of community, because it's never been just us, right? It's always been us and community. That's the power of shared history. That's why shared history is so revolutionary, right? Also, she is actively working to meet with legislators and meet with individuals in community who are supporting this work from all walks of life to develop and to shape policy in real time. So when people ask me, how can we support the study? I usually tell them, share a story, share the work, support the work in that way. But when they say, well, how can I get involved right now in the policy aspects of it, I connect them to Yarkenda. So they're our main core partner. Additionally, History Colorado has stepped forward as a beautiful partner. Our offices are at History Colorado. We're typically there throughout the weeks. We've been there for a full year. The leadership there has been very intentional in honoring the truth and the power of this beautiful history. I can't say enough about Dawn DePrince and how she has very, very mindfully shaped an environment that allows us to feel that she and the leadership support this work. Additionally, allows us to enjoy, quite frankly, the freedom to do this work in a safe space. And also, it's just really cool to work in a museum, that part. So that's kind of where we are. So our job is not to make the recommendations. Our job is to deliver the report and ensure that it will be something viable to leverage those next steps. So
what I want to do right now, I want to know if any of the commissioners want to say anything. There are more commissioners than just them, but giving them opportunity. Then we don't have any more time right now, so I want our chairman of Adult Formation, Mary Jo, to take it from here. See if she got anything she wants to say as well.
Well, thank you so much, Sue. So interesting. We have a million more questions, but yes, thank you. And are you able to stay for a few minutes if people have questions and want to come up? Can you all stay a little bit? That would be terrific. Thank you so much. I want to encourage everybody next Sunday to come. We have a multimedia presentation of music and poetry in the words of Martin Luther King. It's called At the Table with Martin Luther King. Bring friends if you can. I'd love to pack this place. I think it's going to be great. So thank you all for your continued support.